Guten Dagen, Guten Morgen. My name is Terry and I am the Shieldmaiden in the kitchen. Welcome back. So it's December, and so in my kitchen we are in holiday mode. So that's why I've added the German greeting today, because today we're going to share with you a recipe that has deep Germanic tradition, at least for us. And when I say us, that's because we're going to have a special guest with me today who's going to be helping me cook and also sharing some history, and that is my sister Tracy. Welcome.
Hi.
So we're going to share a recipe with you that has very deep traditional roots for our family going back many generations. As a matter of fact, it has a lot of traditional roots in the upper Midwest of the United States, where our family originally immigrated to a little over 100 years ago, amongst the Germanic peoples coming from Northern Europe and also Scandinavia. And the recipe is called Kuchen. In the traditional sense, as a German word, it just strictly translates into cake. But, as you'll see, it's not really cake in the sense of the word that you might think of when you think of cake. It's not like a layer cake or a bundt cake or a sponge cake. It's not even really cakey at all. So it's a very loose translation of a word. It actually has as its base a yeasted sweet roll dough. So it's kind of a bread product. And so it's not even baked in cake tins, although it can be, but in our family traditionally, it wasn't even baked in a bread pan, even though it has a bread base. It's baked in pie plates. And then on the bread dough, we put a mixture of a custard, and we can put in it various things, our family usually putting in some kind of fruit or some kind of cheese. And so we'll show you a little bit of all of that. But it's a traditional recipe for us that has special meaning for the holidays and also other family gatherings. I don't remember it not being at a family gathering.
Yeah, pretty much everyone, yes.
Every single time, yeah. So, and again, it goes back even before us. So time immemorial, maybe, for our family. But we thought, in the spirit of the holidays, that we would share this special recipe and a little bit of family and other history with you as well. So let's get started. I mentioned that this is a recipe that has a sweet yeasted roll dough as its base. And so I have been rising the dough, and it's like really rising. I need a bigger bowl, apparently.
Oh my god.
Because here we go. So this is what goes in the pie plate first, onto which we will put the rest of the ingredients. But I wanted to show you this. This has been rising for probably about an hour and a half. I think probably an hour is good enough, but we're getting a little bit late start, but it won't be a problem. I will post the recipe in the directions or in the description, as I usually do, so you can see what goes into making this, but I've pre-made it so that we could have it already risen and get started today. It's kind of a soft, kind of a sticky dough, but this will make a fair amount of Kuchen, probably about probably about 8 to 10 different versions. And so I'm going to give you half the dough.
Okay.
If we don't use all this, which we probably won't. But I have to say, so this recipe comes from our father's family, and we had kind of a matriarch in the family, and her name was Philippina Bitz by birth, Philippine Benfit by marriage, and she was born in South Dakota in 1895. So she was our great-grandmother, and she definitely was kind of the strong matriarch of our family. And then she had 2 daughters, so our Aunt Lena, as we called her, or her birth name was Magdalena, and then my grandmother Jenny, her birth name was Genevieve. And so it's these 3 women from which Tracy and I get this tradition. Now, one of the things that I definitely remember, and maybe you do too, is going into Ma's house. Philippina is somebody we refer to as Ma. It's like she never even really had a name for us except for Ma.
I didn't know that was her. I didn't know her real name.
We didn't know we knew her real name.
Until I was an adult.
Yeah. I was like, oh, you have a real name. And so I remember going to Ma's house, and this was always in the kitchen, like on the stove, and it was always this giant bowl. She had a bigger bowl than I have here, and so it wasn't overflowing, but there was always this giant bowl of dough that was rising that I always used to think smelled really good and would like to like take pieces off of it.
Yeah, I remember her having literally an apple bobbing tin full of dough. So literally like the huge metal things that you use for apple bobbing, she would have that full of dough. She would have it sitting in the kitchen, and I can still remember her taking a little paring knife and cutting off a piece so that we could eat it, because that was just like,
That was always
that was heaven. It
that
was
was
so
all
great. Yeah.
Yeah. And now you can see, because of handling it, it's already kind of starting to deflate. So we're gonna again divide this up into probably 8 to 10 different little balls so that we can then begin to press them into the pie plates. So we'll move over here onto the workbench and get started putting these together. Okay, so just looking at some of the ingredients, we are going to make 3 different kinds today. We are going to make peach, cherry, and cottage cheese. So you'll see we've got some canned tart cherries that were just in juice, not like pie cherry filling, not the thick kind like that, but just in juice that are draining. And then also canned peaches that were just in water, again, not like a thick sugar syrup, that are also draining. And you want to drain them because you want to get the fruit kind of dry so that it doesn't make the soggy crust underneath it. We've got our little pie plates all ready to go. This is an example of a cookbook from which you can find many variations of this recipe. It's a kind of your traditional sort of mid-20th century church cookbook that's a compilation that all the ladies at the church would contribute various recipes, and so you can find a lot of different types of kuchen in there. And so part of our recipe today comes from this, but then we also have part coming from something else, which is truly in the tradition of kuchen, because it really is kind of an adaptable recipe and everybody has their own sort of way of doing it. Here you can see the handwritten note from one of our relatives for how to do this. And now, so why do we have the fruit on the paper towel?
Basically just because, like Terry was saying before, I was taught to do it this way just to try to keep the bread dough crust from getting soggy before you put the filling into it. And so we have in the past used the actual cherry pie filling, and again, that's not a great thing to use. You can use that, but you want to just kind of pick the cherries out of all of the extra stuff that's in there, because again, it'll just make the crust soggy. So my favorite, which we don't have today, is plum, and that's another one that again you would want to dry, or at least strain and dry on a paper towel, just to make sure that the crust doesn't get soggy.
Okay, and then again, I mean, these recipes are coming from our great-grandmother Ma, and our great-aunt Lena, and our grandmother Jenny. And all of these women basically came from what would be considered farming peasant stock, really, like many of those people who settled in the U.S. at the time our family did. And so we're talking about, again, I mean, these are canned peaches and canned cherries, not fresh, although you can use fresh fruit. But our family never seemed to use fresh fruit. And we also have, you can use milk, but we use evaporated milk. So it very much comes from a tradition of people who were not poor, but certainly working class, and who needed to make use of everything that they had the best way they could. And they grew their own food, and so of course they preserved it as well. And so especially when you are talking about making this recipe around the holidays, you know, we're going to be looking at food that was canned earlier in the year. And so that would have been their access to fresh fruit. So what we're going to do now is go ahead and begin to mix up the custard, which you mentioned we should be doing that before we do the dough.
Yes, because the dough is a yeast dough and it's going to continue to want to rise. It's good to go ahead and make up the custard and get the fruit ready to go before you actually start working with the crust, because it's kind of a quick process where you roll out the dough, put it in the pan, and then it'll want to start to shrink back up or continue rising, and so you need to really get it put together and put it into the oven before it starts to do that.
Okay, so we'll begin looking at making a custard next. Okay, so what we need to do to put together the custard is we've got our cans of evaporated milk, we've got sour cream, and the cottage cheese will be later as a filling. We've also got sugar and then cinnamon to sprinkle on as well. So,
and we've also strained the cottage cheese as well. If you can find dry cottage cheese, that's good as well, but we did go ahead and strain it ahead of time.
Yeah, and I actually strained it, and it's cottage cheese is thick enough that it doesn't even strain that well, and so I ended up actually rinsing it with water in order to get the curd real dry. So that's that. But for the custard part of it, we're going to mix the milk and the sour cream and the eggs and some sugar. So I'll go ahead and put that in there.
And we're gonna actually double the filling recipe. I usually end up kind of sometimes running out of filling as I'm making it. It sort of depends on how many crusts you end up getting out of it. So we're gonna go ahead and double it to begin with. So we have two cans of milk, and then it's going to be 4 cups of sour cream. So each one of these is 2 cups. Each one is 16 ounces.
And this is a 12-ounce can of evaporated milk, or 350 milliliter for you Europeans out there.
And then next we're going to have 6 eggs and a cup of sugar. And I'm having a hard time here.
So that's what total of 4 cups. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, because there's 2 cups in each one of these.
Yeah.
Yes.
So 4 cups of sour cream. For those of you who have watched my other videos and seen me make Icelandic skyr, I would definitely recommend using skyr if you've got it as an interesting experiment, because it's essentially something that is can be swapped out for sour cream in other recipes, and I have done that. So I don't see any reason why you couldn't do it with this as well. So then 1/2 cup of, or 1 cup of.
Yeah, 1 cup of sugar.
1 cup of sugar.
Oops.
There you go. Because
A
that
little
was
extra
mess.
there. We go. Okay. Not a precise science.
Yeah, well, this is the way these recipes are too.
Yes,
Go ahead. No, I was making the dough and using my great Aunt Lena's handwritten scratch recipe, and then it just says add the rest of the flour, but it never gave any indication as to how much flour that was. And so that gives you an idea of how long these women made this recipe. It was just ingrained in their brains, but also the nature of they just kind of made it on the fly, and it sort of can morph and vary over time.
I didn't find out until I was an adult that my great-grandmother, whom Terry talked about earlier, that was born in 1895, and my great-grandfather, that neither one of them could really read or write.
Yeah, Ma only went to school till 1st grade.
Right. And I never understood why she would never read to me when I was little, or why she would never write any of her recipes down. And that's because she couldn't.
Yeah, she was functionally illiterate. She definitely belonged, as I mentioned earlier, they're definitely part of that kind of peasant farming community, and she was one of those people who came from a large Catholic family, and they needed the kids to work on the farm, and so she was only able to go to school through 1st grade before she had to drop out.
So you can obviously use a mixer if you want to go ahead and mix this up, or as we're doing here, a whisk.
So it's a pretty thin mixture, right?
It is, but we're gonna add some flour, and the eggs will help make it solidify as well when it's cooking.
Okay, so now we're ready to roll out the dough, and we're going to dump it out onto a lightly floured surface, right?
Yep.
Here, I'll let you do it.
Thanks.
So
I always put a little flour on my rolling pin first, just to kind of make sure it doesn't stick.
yeah, because this is a kind of a sticky dough.
Just think of, like she had said, like a cinnamon roll type dough would work. Some people actually will, I've even seen people actually make this on regular pie crust as well. I personally don't care for that. I like the dough mixture as well. So go ahead and get a little bit of extra flour because it's pretty sticky.
Get in here. Do we need to use this to like divide it into pieces?
Yeah, and then it's probably easier just to cut it in some smaller pieces. So I'll let you do that.
How many are we gonna try to, like, what do we get? Just like, it's like half?
I would try half, and then let's just try like about that much right there, and then we'll kind of roll it out and see if that's gonna work. We do have several different sizes of pie plates, roughly, so it kind of depends on how big you need it to be for the pie plate. The one in front of me, I think, looks like it's about an 8-inch pie plate, so it's not super big. These, again, you kind of have to work up sort of fast just because your dough is going to want to kind of retract into itself or continue rising. And so the other thing that my great-grandmother would do, and this is also something that she showed me when she would make what we called schmutzkikla, or essentially like grease bread. A lot of people know them as elephant ears.
Fry bread,
Indian fry bread. So she would tell me to basically kind of stretch it over her hand like this and just almost like pizza dough. Just kind of keep going around until you can sort of get kind of a shape that you want. I am getting a little thin in the middle there, so you kind of want to watch that.
One thing I will say about this is that you can use regular all-purpose flour. I actually used bread flour for this, and as some of you probably know, bread flour has a higher gluten content, so therefore, you know, you're going to have a little bit maybe more of that stretchiness. But one of the interesting things I was just thinking about with Ma and her stretching things out over her hand like that was that she had something known as Dupuytren's contracture, which I have, and my father also has.
And I also have it, and it's supposed to be a Viking thing.
No, it definitely is. It's called the Viking disease because it's specific to people who have Scandinavian genetics.
Yep.
So there you go. We're actually Viking people. Proof in our hands.
And you can see that the dough is sticking here, so I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit more flour down. So it's
maybe we use a bigger piece for the next
yeah,
one.
it's a little bit tricky, you know. I just kind of work with it until I sort of get the shape that I want, and then you can kind of throw it into the pan and stretch it out a little bit more. And some people like their crust a little thicker, and some people like it thinner.
Ooh, that was like, I remember that from our childhood. That was a major thing between our Aunt Lena and our grandmother Jenny, who were sisters and who loved each other, but also were kind of mortal enemies at the same time. And one of these fights was over the kuchen dough, where Grandma Jenny liked it one thickness and Lena liked it a different one. And they would die on that hill over which one is better.
Yeah. Well, you know, they all lived in the same house in Portland for 11 years. So they had 3 generations of family that all moved from South Dakota. And so, you know, I'm sure they got tired of each other after a while.
Yeah. We are on the West Coast, as some of you know, and so our family was one of those traditional move out to the West Coast during World War II to get jobs, and so they came out here from South Dakota at that time. But they did bring these definite Germanic traditions with them.
And so you can see it's not pretty, it's not you know, perfectly round shape, and so sometimes you just have to keep working with the dough until you get what you want shape-wise. It can be tricky, so you just sort of have to work with it. This is probably why some people just go with the pie crust instead of the bread dough as the crust, because it's sort of hard to work with sometimes. And it's good to sort of stretch it up, but as you can see with the gluten-y stuff in the dough, that it definitely wants to just keep shrinking back down. So this piece, I might actually even use a smaller pie plate.
Yeah, we have the smaller one here.
So let's go ahead and do that.
Okay.
And that way it'll be, because you don't want, you preferably want the crust to go up above the filling, so that the crust doesn't slink back down. And the other thing that, it's kind of a funny thing that my great grandma always did, and I don't know why, probably, you know, to help keep the bubbles from forming and things like that, but she always took the back of a fork and made marks on the crust, kind of like you would see like on a basketball or a baseball. And that's just something that she just always did. That was kind of her tradition, and so I still do that when I'm making it, just because that's how I was taught, and it makes me think of her.
Okay, we've got the crusts prepared. Here are all of our pie plates with the crusts stretched out. We have a little bit of leftover dough. This is yeasted dough. It can freeze and or be put in the refrigerator if you want to use it later. We have our cottage cheese, because we will do a cheese version, which I like, and then we'll
I don't.
And then she likes the plum kind, and I don't really like that kind. And you like the cherry kind, though, don't you?
I like cherry, and I've actually seen people use blackberries or strawberries or apples. I've done apples before, and I think I've done blackberries, which I had never actually had that before, or made those versions. But really, it seems like most fruit, you know, that you would
make a pie with.
Yeah, would work in these.
We put a little bit of flour on the bottom, right?
I would say, yeah, maybe a little bit more. The flour is going to help absorb the liquid from the fruit. As you can see, like I was talking about before, like with this particular crust, the dough just wants to keep shrinking back in. So this one will work. You know, just like these will work as well. That's why it's kind of, you want to have everything ready to go so you can pour it all in right before you're going to put it in the oven.
Okay, and then what we have here is just an 8 ounce or 1 cup ladle, 237 mil for you Europeans out there. And so you're going to, you can see the consistency. It's almost like a really thin pancake batter, kind of.
Yeah.
Okay, and then you want to do
that. So we put the fruit on first after you put the flour on. And I guess I'll start with this one, and you can kind of do as much or as little as you want. You know, some people like a lot of fruit, some people just do a little bit. Sometimes I will cut these in half lengthwise so that the fruit's a little thinner. And then with the filling will rise a little bit as it bakes, and as it solidifies. So you want it to be covering that. I'm gonna go ahead and move this out of the way. Oh,
have some more.
Yep, just throw it on there. Okay. Quickly putting the fruit in the thing.
And then what? Just like dab the cottage cheese.
Yeah. Okay. Which one are you going to use the cottage cheese for?
I can do that one. Or
okay. Are you going to do?
I'll just do one cottage cheese one.
Okay. So we'll do. We have a lot more peaches left, so we'll do another peach.
Yeah. Okay. And then how much of this cottage cheese? It's just.
I would just probably a little bit, just like you would do with the fruit.
So, and as you can tell, again, it's very dry curd because I drained it, but then I also rinsed it with water and then got it to be very less milky. And then this will still keep, and you can eat it, the rest of it, like regular cottage cheese, like you normally would if you eat that. Okay, so we'll coat the bottom of the pie pan there.
And I actually eat gluten-free, so I don't usually eat this. But I will say that the filling by itself, you can also make in a pie or custard type dish and bake it without the crust, and it also tastes very good without the crust. Of course, being that I'm European, I love bread of all sorts, but unfortunately I need to eat gluten-free, so I like making the stuff, and then so that I can have a little bit of it, I just go ahead and cook the filling by itself with the fruit and the cinnamon and sugar, and it tastes great.
Yeah, I mean, and historically speaking, I mean, we were talking about this coming from a Germanic tradition in our family and other families who immigrated to the United States, and so it's not that old of history, but it does have other roots in European cooking. You can definitely find lots of examples in medieval cookbooks about the use of custards, both in sweet and savory ways. Primarily, people did drink some milk, mostly cow's milk, but sometimes goat or sheep milk as well. But the milk was more often used in other ways, i.e. with the skyr that I've shown you how to make before, or also in a custard or in cheeses as well. So they fermented and used it in other ways where it would keep for longer periods of time. And so again, this is part of a real long tradition of cookery, at least in medieval European tradition.
So I'm just kind of starting with putting a little bit of filling on, and then I'll go back and add if I need to add some more, but I want to make sure I have enough for all of them first. So I'm going to go ahead and add that.
And so the recipe that I will post in the description for the dough, you can see the amount that we have left over would probably be enough to make 2 more kuchen. So we have, what do we got here, 6, so yeah, 8, and I mentioned it would make 8 to 10, so, and you can easily cut this recipe in half as well if you don't want to make as many. Also, I mean, I just said kuchen. I mean, it's interesting that the word is Kuchen with an N on the end of it, and that's how you see it when you look it up in recipe books. Except for I never, ever remember my great-grandmother or my grandma or my great-aunt saying that. It was always just kuchen. And so I didn't even realize it had an N on the end of it until I got older and started taking German in high school and in college. And so I think, again, it kind of really underscores the really fluid nature of this kind of family traditional recipe where even what you call it kind of just sort of morphs and changes over time.
Yeah, I also took German in high school, and I have found that, I was always basically under the assumption that these were German dishes. But then when I started taking German, and I actually went to Germany for a short period of time after high school, that most actual modern day Germans had no idea what this was. They didn't know. I mean, of course, they think you say Kuchen, you think cake, but this is not really cake. And we, took the N off because they spoke a lot of Low German and maybe even a little bit of Russian in there as well. So, yeah, modern day Germans don't really know what this is, but you talk to people that live in North and South Dakota, and they actually know a lot about this because they still cook it. There's even some restaurants that actually make it as well. So, yeah, it's definitely not going to be necessarily a modern day German dish. And then I've also found that some other types of, ethnic groups, Norwegians, they also have a version of this as well. We just kind of make it as we want, but generally the recipe is usually pretty similar. And so what Terry's doing now is we're going to sprinkle a little bit of cinnamon and sugar on the top. You can also do a little bit of nutmeg if you want as well, because the fruit that we used isn't really sweet. There's not a lot of sugar in the filling itself, and so they usually put a little bit of sugar on the top as well. So she's doing some of the cinnamon, and I will go ahead and just sprinkle a little bit, and it probably amounts to maybe about 1/8 to 1/4 of a cup when you actually sprinkle it in. My relatives never actually used a measuring cup, so they just pretty much just sprinkled it on. And if you like
to taste,
right, if you like, yeah, exactly. If you want it a little sweeter, add a little bit more sugar, and you could also use fruit that's got the heavier syrup on it if you want it as well. That's also sweeter as well.
Here's the kuchen ready to be put in the oven, and also an example of some little ramekins with just the custard, as my sister mentioned. If you need to eat gluten-free, so without the crust, you can make a nice little custard dish with the fruit in it also. All right, and then we have the oven that has been heated to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. And so we will now put them in the oven. The oven is full. It's as full as my oven has ever been. 6 kuchen. They barely fit, but because I have convection and I can take advantage of the fan, hopefully they will all cook relatively similarly. So we will see. They need to bake for about 25 to 30 minutes. So we're gonna set a timer and check on the early end of that and then see what we've got. These are our finished kuchen, and you'll see that we've got varying degrees of browning on the bread dough around the edges. This one is a little bit lighter. This is partly a consequence of cooking 6 of them in the oven at the same time, so we had to kind of shift them around a little bit in order to get even cooking. This took a total of about half an hour, so we started with 20 minutes and then we took a look to see if they were done, and then just added more time as we needed. And so with a custard product like this, generally, you kind of do the jiggling, and if you see it's mostly solidified around the edges, but a slight jiggle towards the middle, then that signifies that it's done enough to be pulled out, because it will continue cooking for a little while, especially if you're using a convection setting. And then also, these freeze really nice, and also you can store them in the refrigerator as well, and that cooling will provide a little bit more, sort of bringing it together also. So we have, 3 peach, 2 cherry, and 1 cottage cheese. So we have enough for somebody's holiday. So thank you for coming and sharing our family recipe with everyone.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, good. And now we have our dog Rosie, and Tracy's dog Rosie, here with us, very much sniffing and interested in what we've got here. So hopefully you make this for your family. Give it a try. If you do, please put some notes in the comments and let me know what happens. Otherwise, as usual, if you like what I do, please like and share and subscribe. And so from our house to yours, we'll say Glettelig Jol, as they say in Old Norse, or
Frohe Weihnachten in German.
And Merry Christmas. Thanks, Rosie.